pretty sure about open source and inner source and how to have an open culture around that, if I'm not mistaken, right? Great. So give it up for Lars.
Geared up. And now my presentation disappeared. Let's find it. So we are always looking for speakers. So please contact one of the Aarhus.js teams, me or Jacob or Philip, for example, if you want to do a talk. It's for first-time talkers, experienced talkers, whatever. We welcome all of you. And usually I don't waste time introducing myself. I want to give you good content, but right now I'm struggling to find this PowerPoint presentation. So I can mention that I started in this meetup as a public speaker. It was called Aarhus.js, or sorry, NG Aarhus back then. It was about Angular. Now it's about everything JavaScript. But that was my first public speaking experience, and I can only recommend it. Today I'm 3 times Microsoft MVP and 3 times, hopefully soon, GitHub Star, the only one in Denmark, but maybe you're the next one. So feel free to ask me about anything about that as well. But for now, let's go have this talk. So because this is last minute, I didn't have time to change it. This is geared towards open source developers and maintainers. So how many are doing open source maintenance right now? Show of hands. Great. And how many are using open source? Awesome. So the thing you can take with you today is maybe you can help use this to evaluate how open an open source project is. And maybe your company is even considering doing open source. You can bring some learning from this talk as well. Even if you're doing what's called inner source, there's also things to take from this talk. And I would even say that open culture is something that goes for every kind of community or group. Even if it's closed source, you can still think differently about the way you're developing your product. So that's what this talk is about. I will probably skip some of the things that are a little bit more open source, like governance, unless you want me to talk about it, but I'll ask you. So starting up is open culture is about the first and the lasting impressions when discovering and joining an open source community. And I want to start out with this article by Matt Rocklin called 7 Stages of Open Source Software. So he lists 7 stages that an open source project can go through, not necessarily. The important thing is don't skip any of the steps if you want to have a healthy community for your open source project. And the other thing is there's an open approach and a closed approach to every one of these stages. So the first one is publicly visible source code. So you could interpret that as, yeah, we uploaded our code to GitHub. It's in a public repo, so now it's open source. Yeah, you could argue that, but there's more to open source than that, especially if you consider it as openness in open source. So, and also, it's not a given that an open source project has a public repo that literally everyone can access. So the second one, licensed for reuse. We let people use it for free, but that's not always the case. Sometimes there's limitations based on the license. Sometimes we discriminate against businesses or groups of people, and then it's not really truly open, as in openness, free, Libra, any of these. The third stage is accepting contributions. So that is taking in contributions from the public, right? But there's an open and a closed approach to that, because maybe we only have you can only submit a patch if you're part of a certain group or you're paying for a certain tier. So then it's not really open source. And it's not that uncommon to see things like these out in the world. The fourth stage is open development. So that's about communicating about your development process in the open. That's not a given for an open source project either. So consider these points when you're considering the openness of an open source project, or if you're doing one yourself and you're thinking, what can I do better to make it useful for more people? The fifth stage is open decision making. So that's inviting people in from the community to be part of the decision making process. The sixth stage is where usually the creators of the open source project go on and remove some of that bias of having just one person or one company deciding everything about the open source project. So that's where it goes across groups of people, groups of businesses, and that leads to the seventh stage where the creator can retire, knowing that the project will live on. Okay, so what is open culture? It's a commitment. It's a way of honoring the openness in open source. It goes on these three principles: being open, being transparent, and being inclusive. And that goes for everything in your community and your project. So if we were to make a statement, it would be that an open culture promotes free and equal access for literally everyone, no limitations. So an open culture enables the community members of an open source project to use, copy, and modify the project regardless of their origin, their resources, access to certain systems or tools, regardless of people's skill set and experience. So this ensures that we have no favoritism, no limitation based on sponsorship levels or other factors, that we can use and contribute to the project without any proprietary systems, and that the project is accessible to newcomers to our community, and that we welcome non-code contributions. So to learn more about an open culture, let's look at some characteristics of a closed culture. So what is open source? It's up to our interpretation for sure, but here we will highlight what's definitely not. And I'm not saying that open or closed is good or bad. I'm just saying that there's open and there's closed. You sit somewhere on that spectrum with your open source project, so it's up to us as maintainers to decide on which path we want to choose. Do we want to be more open or more closed? And it'll also evolve over time. But what happens with a closed culture is we are too busy to accept contributions, so let's just focus on development. But what do you think comes first, the open culture or the community? It's the culture. You will not have any contribution from the outside if you're not making an effort to invite them in. So another example of closed culture is strategic open source. That's open source that makes sense from a business perspective. These are all reasons, closed culture reasons for doing open source, because it's a buzzword. Everyone wants to do it. Everyone think they should do it, but no one or too few know how to do it or even why to do it. It's also a closed culture reason for doing it is monetizing. It's usually found in startups, big tech companies, to fund and attract investments, or for doing the open source bait and switch like Docker, MongoDB, Elastic, and Akka. I even see enterprises doing it just for vanity, to gain prestige, to join an open source foundation, or to attract investments. And I'm not saying that it's bad, it's just not open. So another closed culture characteristic is no one else is contributing. And because of that, we manage and govern the project internally. So again, what comes first, the community or the culture? And it's the culture. So I joined an enterprise last year, and what I experienced when joining an open source project was more like a doctor sitting there. So after I reviewed your symptoms, I believe you're suffering from the condition known as open source software. So I would see managers sweeping by with clipboards, check, 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 now we're open source. But what do you think, if you can read these points? Is this open source as in openness, open culture? I mean, this is similar to what's called the GitHub Community Standards checklist, but that's not where open source ends. It's just the bare minimums to call yourself an open source project. There's more to it. But what I heard from developers on the different teams working on these open source projects is, but we did make it public on GitHub. We did choose an open source license, so what else is there? That's all there's to it, right? And I'm sorry to disappoint, but it's not all there's to it. At least not if you believe in openness in open source. So my response to this is a set of guiding principles that I call the community experience of your open source project. So the first one is called the time to first experience, and it sounds like a metric, but if you're measuring this, you're doing it wrong. It's a principle, not a metric. So this is about how fast can any person use the project in some environment. So maybe we set up a demo or sandbox environment. We could use GitHub Pages, Azure Static Web Apps, Azure Container Apps, Azure Kubernetes Service. And then it's just about how fast can we get someone using this system, trying it out for the first time. The next principle is time to first line of code. This is about how fast can any person develop a system using the project. To support this, we can provide code generators, development containers, GitHub code spaces, StackBlitz web containers. There's plenty of tools out there. The next one is time to first environment. So how fast can we get someone up and running with an environment that they control? And there's tools for this as well. We can release packages, of course. We can release OCI container images. We can support our community with infrastructure as code. And good examples of this is Azure. They have the new Azure Developer CLI inspired by the Azure Static Web Apps CLI. So this is a good experience for developers to get up and running fast with a real application in Azure. I'm also part of the community by Narwhal, the build framework called NX, and they provide to us developers in the community GitHub Actions and GitHub reusable workflows, GitHub Apps, Circle CI Orbs, Azure Pipelines Task, and StackBlitz web containers, all to get us up and running fast. I created a library. It's a logging library for Angular called Lumberjack, and we are a plugin-based logging library. So we want community contributions with plugins owned by other people. So to support this, we created a GitHub template repo, and for the project-specific plugins that you just want for your own project, maybe closed source, we have code generators for this. So this is another example of supporting this experience of time to first environment. And we're getting towards the end of the principles. This one is the time to first contribution. So to support this, we can have guidelines for patch submissions, feature requests, bug reports, vulnerability disclosures, and how to sign off on contributions if that's required by our project. We can also supply developers with development tooling, such as development containers and GitHub code spaces. For documentation, we can create this link on every page that says edit this page, open up a pull request. For example, I use Docusaurus for this, and at work we use a project called MKDocs that's markdown based. And we should also not forget about supporting non-code contributions. Documentation is one example, but there's plenty others like graphics, project management, community, which leads us to the final principle, ecosystem support. So how can we support ambassadors and members of our community to help promote and advance our project? Well, we can supply them with prefabricated content kits, like a press kit, but for community content. We can provide them with logos, images, other graphics, slide deck templates, prefabs, teacher-student resources, workshop resources, e-learning modules, certification programs, tutorials, articles, books, videos, and events. What can we do to promote an open culture in a project, in our company, in a source, for closed source? There's plenty on this topic. I will go through my favorite ones. This one is important to everyone. Open communication. So an open culture will focus on visibility with an emphasis on communication in the open. So literally in public for an open source project. But if it's inner source, public as in company-wide, right? So in an open culture, the project members will primarily communicate using tools that are freely available and open to anyone. So private conversations about the project will be at a minimum, because then everyone is involved in the conversation or able to do so. So we will have public or company-wide Discords and Slack channels where we discuss the project, and not in private, direct messages and private chat rooms or private mailing lists. We could also use GitHub discussions and have most of our communication in GitHub issues and pull requests. So in an open culture, the project members also present plenty of opportunities for engagement and direct communication with the community. The communication in an open culture is welcoming and inclusive. We support newcomers through guidance and mentorship. And community members in minority populations are not treated differently. In fact, we often ask them, how can we make this experience better for you as the minority in our community, to give them their voice and better meet their needs. So contrast this with a closed culture. In a closed culture, there's restricted or limited access to some of the communication tools based on sponsorship level or other factors that discriminate. Discussions with a direct impact on the projects, for example, on architecture and development, happen in private chat rooms or private mailing lists. There's little to no help or support for new community members just entering the project. So to advocate for an open culture when it comes to open communication, we use open communications tools. They are platform agnostic, and in the case of open source project, we use some that are popular and commonly used by other open source projects. So we try our best to avoid direct and private communication, to show respect for community members' time, maintainers' time, and respect for their attention, and to ensure open and equal access for everyone. Next one is open documentation. This is an interesting one because I love documentation. Maybe not everyone does, but it helps both the maintainers, the contributors, the users, and the developers in an open source community. So open source promotes modification. But without documentation, it's difficult to understand the source code if you have the intent of modifying the code, and that's what open source should promote. There's an organization called Open Source Ecology, and it states that undocumented open source is effectively not open. In an open culture, documentation is available to everyone, not just the premium sponsors, not just to the team or the organization leading the effort, no, to everyone. No paywalls, no regional limitations, anything like that. So newcomers are supported both when it comes to using and contributing to the documentation. And of course, there is more to documentation than just end-user documentation. So a great documentation will cover all areas of an open source project, like the mission and the governance, but also the community structure, the release cadence, roadmap and priorities, use cases, FAQs. And for the user-facing documentation, we can have installation guides and user guides and tutorials and API guides, architectural overviews, maybe even an experience sharing section, and of course guidelines for participation, like how to submit a feature request, what's the process for that, and the bug reporting as well. For code contributors, we can document how to get involved with the project. We can have developer guides and tutorials, an API guide, and a more detailed architecture mapping to subsystems and services are part of the project. We can document the development process and have guidelines for feature requests and bug reports, but also vulnerability disclosures and how to sign off on code contributions. So again, we contrast this to a closed culture where the project is undocumented or the access is closed or limited or it's hidden. Maybe the documentation is even considered poor or unmaintained, and there is no help or support for new users or contributors that want to enter this project. So as individual contributors, we can review and improve the guidelines both for development and documentation. We can help improve the documentation by exploring or explaining our architectural decisions, the code structure on the things we build, and even the features we help build ourselves. We can help review documentation contributions, especially give feedback and offer ideas for improving the contribution. And of course, we should also add good inline documentation to the source code, or it's essentially not open. If you're part of a leadership or an open source foundation, so leadership for open source projects, do the effort to prioritize documentation as a parallel track because it requires a different set of skills than implementing code. You can help incentivize the contributors to write good documentation, but use intrinsic motivation, not money rewards. Speak to their values as contributors, as proud workers doing documentation. Maybe you can consider sponsoring interns or technical writers to create documentation. It's a good first step for contributing to an open source project. And make sure that our documentation has clear and proper licensing and copyright information. So the final section is open governance. Is this something you want to hear about? Yeah. Because of course it's relevant not only to open source but also inner source or any kind of governance for your project. There's lessons to be learned. There's the open and closed principles. So transparency is one of the principles of open culture, and when it comes to governance, it's about thinking who can participate in the discussions and importantly decide on critical matters for the project. How transparent are these decision-making processes, and is literally anyone able to follow the project discussions and meetings? In open source, the governance is mostly or ideally based on meritocracy. So this is the commitment that the individuals leading the project get their roles based on talent, efforts, and achievements within the project context. It's also the governance model that ensures the accessibility for any contributor to eventually be promoted to what's called a committer, a reviewer, or a maintainer on the project. And this project of how to become promoted is clearly documented and is equitable for everyone. So when it comes to governance, an open culture is focused on visibility, emphasis on open decision-making processes, and open communication. It ensures equal footing to all current and future contributors, and members of the open source community can access discussion platforms, decision-making mechanisms, project roadmaps to understand the why and the how of this project's decisions. And it welcomes newcomers. They have the freedom and access to participate in public discussions, in development, and in testing. Anyone is able to submit patches, and both the developers and the users are involved in the testing process. So this gives users a more direct path to influence the project, An example of this is public betas and release candidates, but also user testing as an effort, right? So the meritocracy governance models drives the advancement and acceptance by granting leadership roles to the contributors who provide the most value to the community of this project, not based on other factors. So a closed culture is doing this because of strategic open source. They might not have any governance. Its community and governance structure is dominated by or biased towards one individual, a certain company, a coalition, or commercial interests, usually the founder of the project. It could also be discriminatory governance, which excludes certain groups of people or organizations. It has limited access based on sponsorship levels or other factors, and there's no clear path for how to be or container. A closed culture has hidden, closed, or obscured decision-making processes. So how can we advocate for more open governance in our projects? We can understand, follow, and participate in the open governance of the project, all the processes, and help advocate for making them more open. We can support the right structure for the size of the project and where it is in its life cycle, because it does change over time. At some point you need something that's more scalable. Initially it's okay to move fast and have just one or a few people influence the project, but very soon if you want a healthy community, you need to involve more people. So we can also recommend improvements both based on our own experience participating in this project or other open source projects. If we're part of a leadership group for open source, if we establish new open source projects with industry partners, that's especially if you're part of an open source foundation, we need to aim for balanced governance that gives equal footing to all participants. So a governance that welcomes contributors and supports a diverse community. So also for leadership, set the project governance with community structure, with growth and scale in mind, adopt practices that work well in other projects, build in the ability to change as the project evolves, and support new projects to create and document these processes before they launch. They change over time, but it is a big benefit to have them ready at launch time. This talk was very much inspired by this free white paper by the Linux Foundation, determining the true openness of open source projects. So go download that and read it if you want even more tips and details on how to be open in open source.